Hi everybody, welcome to the Wilderness Lecture Series, which is sponsored by the Wilderness Institute, part of the College of Forestry and Conservation. This year's series is called Wild Waters in the West. I'm Lori Young, I'm standing in for Natalie Dawson this week. She coordinates this series and she'll be back with you next Tuesday. I just want to remind you that next week's lecture is by Chris Caliper, who's coming all the way from Alaska to talk about cleaning up marine debris in remote sites along the Alaska coastline. He's the founder and president of the Gulf of Alaska Keeper, and I think it will prove to be a really interesting lecture. I want to thank Ron and Missoula Community Access Television for filming this series, and also the College of Forestry and Conservation for their support. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Vermillion to you. Dan is joining us from Livingston, Montana. He grew up along the banks of the Yellowstone River. After spending years guiding some of the world's most exotic and famed fisheries, Dan formed Sweetwater Travel with his brothers, Pat and Jeff Vermillion. Sweetwater Travel operates fishing camps in Mongolia, Brazil, the Bahamas, Andros Island, Alaska, British Columbia, and Montana. Dan also serves as a commissioner for the southwestern Montana area of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. In 1995, Dan and his brothers opened the first fly fishing only operation in Mongolia for Thai men. You guys can come on in, grab a seat. For Thai men, which is the world's largest salmon. Through his experiences as a guide and lodge owner in Mongolia, Dan has developed a passion for conserving some of the world's most important and productive taimen habitat. This passion led Dan to form the world's first taimen conservation project in the Eggur watershed in Mongolia. The Taimen Conservation Fund received an innovative grant from the Global Environmental Facility and the Development Marketplace Award from the Honorable James Wilkinson, the President of the World Bank. The Taimen Conservation Fund, along with its nonprofit partner, the Tributary Fund, has successfully preserved taimen in the Eggur watershed, constructed a Buddhist monastery as the cultural basis for this effort, and contributed to sustainable development efforts in the Eggur area. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dan Vermillion, who will be talking about mega fish conservation in Central Asia. So, welcome.
So this may be a slideshow you all get credit for, hopefully. Thanks very much for having me up here from Livingston. I went to school here, so it's kind of interesting and odd to come back as actually be talking in one of these classrooms. So tonight I'll just talk to you a little bit about taimen conservation in Mongolia. As Lori mentioned, our company's called Sweetwater Travel. We've got operations in the Bahamas, the Sestat, up in British Columbia, up in Alaska at the Royal Coachman, and down on the Yellowstone River in Montana, as well as Brazil. Tonight I'm going to talk to you guys about, and I did bring some brochures for you if you want to see what the taimen fishery is all about, and some more in-depth pictures and a little more in-depth explanation of the taimen fishing. I've been in the fishing business since I guess I was 18. Growing up in Billings, we moved to, after my first summer of college, I got a job guiding up in Alaska. And, that career path, kind of every summer I ended up, getting out of school, and the first thing I did was get on an airplane to go fish somewhere and spend my summer doing that. And after guiding for a few years, I came back. I decided it was probably time to get a real job, so I came up to Missoula to go to law school. And literally got out of law school in 1995 and took the bar exam, and as soon as I finished the bar exam, the next day I got on a flight for Mongolia and planned that I would go fish in Mongolia for a couple weeks, come back and start my law career in Billings. Got to Mongolia, and on our third cast, literally my third cast in Mongolia, we caught this fish. And this was one of those situations where it was the first fish we'd caught over there. We'd heard stories about this fishery and about these fish when we'd guided in Russia back in the early 90s. And when this fish jumped out of the water, it was 58 inches long, and it just seemed impossibly big. It just bigger than you could, you grow up fishing on the Yellowstone, and you really hope for a 22-inch brown someday. And when this fish jumped, we just thought, wow, can you imagine how if this is just a normal fish, can you imagine what the big ones are like? And in fact, this was a big one. So we haven't really caught many bigger than that. But we got over there, and as soon as we got there, we started seeing things like this. And as a fisherman and as a guy, I was trying to actually start a law practice. My brother Jeff was fully committed and saw this fishery and said, wow, this is a great place to start a fishing lodge. And Mongolia had just started to, gained its independence in the early 90s, and it was just starting to kind of get its feet underneath it. But what it had was a country about 2.5 times the size of Texas with barely 2 million people at that time, most of whom lived in the capital. And it had, beautiful, beautiful forests, great elk herds, wolf packs, bears, deer, a whole host of wildlife that you really don't expect to see in Asia. So our first trip, we got to Mongolia. We got picked up at the airport by this guy who we didn't know from Adam's House Cap, but he picked us up, and he had a Russian Jeep. And we all got in the Russian Jeep, and we were driving out to the river, and he stopped, and the first thing he did was pull out his .30-06 and start shooting at prairie dogs. And as you can imagine, if you shoot a prairie dog with a .30-06, there's typically not much left. And then they go in ahead and proceeded to start putting him on treble hooks and throw him into the river. And, we clearly realized we were in the right place. We questioned whether we had any flies that could compete with that. But it turns out we did. And, we fished for 2 great weeks over there, and we came back. And the Mongolian Puji, who we call Pervdorch, who's now the executive director of the Taiman Conservation Fund over there, became our partner. And just a little story about Puji. When we first met him, he lived in a small apartment in a small dusty town in the provincial capital of Huvsgol province and had 1 Jeep, which at that time was a lot for anybody to have. He now owns a hotel in the capital, has better cars than we do, and has been very successful, partially through ecotourism and other business ventures. But one of the things that strikes you when you go to Mongolia is, we all, drive across the fields of Montana, across the plains of Montana, and at some point say to ourselves, God, I wonder what Montana would have looked like before the fences, before the roads, and it seems like a cliche, what did it look like 200 years ago? Well, Mongolia is the first place I've ever been where I think that I've come pretty close to finding the answer. The countryside, it's changed and it's changing, but it's still it is still the least populated on a density per capita basis of any country in Central Asia. And it still has elk herds, it still has wolves, it still has bears, and it still has a lot of the things, and it still has taimen, and a lot of the things that really, really drew us to that country when we first got there. The other fish that we found there, in addition to the taimen, was a lennik. And the lennik's the oldest trout species in the world, and they are, they're great dry fly fish. They're a lot of fun to fish for, and they're much more prevalent and easier to find typically than the taimen. So I thought I'd just show you real quickly just a few fish pictures before I get into the nuts and bolts of the conservation project that we launched back, in the early 2000s. And granted, I don't know how many of you are fly fishermen, but all these fish are caught on dry flies with floating lines. And the other part that's kind of odd is that you catch these fish typically in a river that's not much bigger than the Yellowstone. And the other river we fish is probably about the size of Rock Creek up around here. So there's a lot of big fish over there. So I'll tell you a little bit about the taimen, and then feel free to, if you have any questions about the presentation or the conservation project that we launched, please let me know. So taimen, are called Hucho taimen. They're most closely related to the lake trout. They spend their entire life in rivers, not lakes, and have basically been removed from about 90% of their habitat. For those of you that are more biologically inclined than me, or you understand the family tree a little bit better than I do, this is how they fit into the family of fish. You can see they're a salmonid, and that they're sort of on the same line there as char, trout, salmon, the taimen, and then the last one, the Brachymatix, is the lennick. But the cool thing is these fish are probably the base, and certainly the lennick, as it's been explained to us by the scientists, are the base of, they're the first trout. These were the first trout on Earth, through the evolutionary process, and then spawned and spread out across the world. So where do taimen live? At one point in time, taimen had the largest range of any salmonid in the world. You had a taimen population that lived down in China, one that lived up pretty much in North Korea that you can see. The big taimen that are over here, if you look at the taimen that live in the Sea of Okhotsk in Russia and in Sakhalin Island and northern, I'm forgetting the island right now, in Japan, where they have taimen. And these taimen actually go out into the ocean, and then they follow the salmon up the rivers and eat the salmon as they go up the rivers. And in the early 90s, there were Americans that had heard about this, and when perestroika took place and people started opening up fisheries on the Pacific side, a group of fairly industrious and really hardy, one of whom was Matt Potter, the guy that owns Kingfisher here, went over to the Sea of Okhotsk and fished this area for taimen, and they had a really tough time. And the reason they had such a hard time is all these big taimen had moved up the river chasing these cherry salmon that weighed between 6 and 14, 15 pounds, and they were just gorging on these salmon. And they could not get the taimen to actually look at a fly because all they were doing was eating the salmon. The other place where taimen is pretty prevalent, and really what I tell people is they basically ran from the Danube all the way to the Pacific Ocean, is in Central and kind of Eastern Central Europe. And then the Hucho taimen, which is what we fish, which is in Siberia, Mongolia, and these, Kazakhstan, countries like that. Now, you can see this is sort of the orange line there, the orange jotted lines there. That's the original range of the taimen. The truth of the matter is, today you'd find them in much fewer places than that line would indicate. When I first got to Mongolia back in 1995, and when the first expeditions were led over there in like 1992, 93, you could catch taimen within about an hour or 2 hours of the capital. There were elk on the outskirts of the capital. And today, you really do have to drive a good 10 or 12 hours outside of the capital to find what I would call pretty acceptable, interesting taimen fishing. So Mongolia has one of the last thriving populations of taimen in the world. As I mentioned, it's the least populated country on planet Earth with 4.5 people per square mile. The population now has moved to 2.8 million people. The overwhelming majority of them live in the capital. I don't know how many of you have seen the articles recently about the mining boom that's going on in Russia or Mongolia right now. Fortunately for us, at least at this point, the majority of the mining has been down in the Gobi Desert. We do have some mining around us, and at some point that'll probably become a much bigger threat to our fishery than it is now. But one of the threats that we are seeing, and one of the incidental benefits to the country is, these people now, there's a lot more economic prosperity. So you've got people who used to not be able to get to these rivers are now have the money and the means to drive to some of the rivers that we've been fishing. As I'm sure probably most of you know, Mongolia is primarily an agricultural country, although this is changing, and you can see that their livestock to human ratio is about 11-1. And the other part that's really wonderful about Mongolia is their literacy rate is 98%. And one of the things I'm sure, if you've looked and studied the countries of any place where the Soviets were, they didn't do a lot of things right, but one of the things they really did do a good job with was making sure that people had the basic literacy skills to succeed. So where did the taimen live in Mongolia? here is basically the capital. This is the far eastern part of of Mongolia. It's over on the Russian border. And this river is called the Taftgol, the Ikgol, I guess it's called. But it's way over here and it very rarely gets fished, except it does get poached by the Chinese. This is a stretch of Mongolia called the Onan area, and has very good time in fishing. This is the Orkhan, was the closest fishing to the capital, but it is now pretty well gone. And then the stuff to the northeast or northwest is where we are, where a guy like Andy Parkinson or Fish Mongolia is, and then the Czechs are up towards the the northern border there. So really, Mongolia in 1995, this is where you could find taimen. Fact of the matter is, today I would tell you that you can find taimen in the two biggest swaths there for as far as taimen go. You could find some taimen way out on the eastern side, but from what I understand, it's not what it was. One of the great things about Mongolia is, so Mongolia, when it became independent from the Soviet Union or the Russians in the early 90s, they sent a lot of, and the United States and the United Nations were very aggressive in bringing some of the smartest and the most educated Mongolians over to the Western universities to teach them about natural resource conservation. So there were a bunch of, the former prime minister, I think, went to the University of Oregon Law School. But there were a bunch of Mongolians that came over here and went to some of our best natural resource management programs. They have the red list here, and they got both on the red book. The taimen are listed as a threatened species under both, which is sort of an equivalent of the Endangered Species Act without the teeth. Is the way I would describe it. And the reason it's listed as a threatened species is there are threats. So the threats in Mongolia have really, I would say, have evolved over time. When we first got there in 1995 and we started our fishery, we kind of, if you had asked me how long do you think you'll be there, I would have told you if we're really lucky, we'll get 5 years out of this place, because we really didn't believe, that Mongolia would be in a position to resist change the way it's been, or at least be able to protect its fishery. And so we felt really compelled to try to figure out how are we going to go about keeping these fish around. And the goal has always been, let's keep these fish around long enough that the civil justice and the justice infrastructure and the law enforcement infrastructure gets put in place to actually enforce these great rules. Because in addition to the Red Book's status and protecting, at least acknowledging the threats to taimen that way, Mongolia also has great environmental laws on the books. It's single hook barbless for taimen. Now, enforcement is still an issue. So the other part of what somebody like Dan Bailey's been working on, who goes to school over here, and the Taimen Conservation Fund, is like teaching them how to do catch and release and why catch and release is so important. And the idea is that if we can give the folks, because we knew that change was coming to the country, there were going to be more and more fishermen on the ground eventually, that if you could teach the fishermen who are going to be fishing there to take care of the fish, then hopefully you can evolve to a point where you have kind of a Montana model where people, a river can sustain a lot of fishing pressure, but because people take care of the fish, at the end of the day, the fish are in pretty good shape. Do lose a few, no question about it, but 96 to 98% of what we do from catch and release, at least in Mongolia and Montana, typically survive as long as the water temps are okay and people handle the fish correctly. So this is what we used to see. I mean, it was very disheartening when we first got over there. You'd come around a corner and you'd run into somebody like this, and it was pretty well intentioned. They just didn't really know any better. And part of it was we wanted, that's how they show what they caught. And we'd talk to them about catch and release, and they'd kind of look at us like, well, didn't you guys make a lot of the same mistakes you're telling us not to make today? And the answer, of course, is yes. And hopefully with, we've learned how to manage these fisheries in a way that is sustainable. And our goal, honestly, is to just give them the same opportunity. The biggest threat, of course, fishing pressure, how fishing gets managed is a pretty easy one to deal with as long as you've got a dedicated group of employees and conservation groups that are willing to really work on that and to pursue it. Gold mining, as I said, Mongolia is having a huge mining boom right now. And, you know, as much as I like to think we could stop a mine in the Yeager watershed, I just don't know that, you know, the economics are such that we could. So far, I mean, Mongolia has passed a law a couple years ago which basically designated key drainages in Mongolia as non-mining drainages because of their exceptional time in fishing or their aquatic values. And the Yeager is one of those. Now, if Mongolia has really developed to the point where that means absolutely no mining under no circumstances, you know, that's a success. Whether they've gotten to that point or not, I'm not 100% sure or convinced. The other big threat that is faced by Taimen are dams. Any of you that studied Taimen conservation realize that dams are not particularly good. And when we put this, you know, when this project was first put together, we sort of had the impression that these fish, Taimen that lived in the drainage where we were working, moved through vast swaths. You know, they would move 100 miles, 150 miles during a year. So if you had a dam and you cut down that migration, you wouldn't have that push of fish, or your fish wouldn't be able to take advantage of all the habitat they needed to survive. But as I'll show you in the speech, what we're finding out is less and less. These fish don't move nearly as much as we thought. They're they're resident fish. And for years, the Japanese Development Agency had pushed a mine or a dam on the Lower Egg River, which is down by the Selenge. And that was a big concern to us, but now they've, you know, and on the other hand, Mongolia does need clean power because you go to the capital and it burns some of the dirtiest coal in the world. The other big threat that Mongolia faces, and this is just sort of they're right next to China, and Mongolia has incredible natural resources. And the Chinese are starting to make a lot of very aggressive investments all across the country, and slowly but surely, you know, that could change the country, and so we're worried about that. But again, that's a bigger battle than a fishing guide or a small conservation group can probably fight. So where's our project? So this is the Yeager drainage, which is where we've been for a very long time. For those of you that know the geography of Central Asia, you can see up here in the top center you've got Lake Baikal, and over here you've got Lake Hovsgol. So Mongolians suggest and say that basically Lake Hovsgol and Lake Baikal at one time were one lake, and that at some point in the past there was a big geological event and mountains formed in between the two waterways. So now all the water that is in Lake Hovsgol comes all the way through here into the Selenge River and goes all the way into the Selenge and dumps back into Lake Baikal. And then it goes up to the Arctic Ocean. Lake Hovsgol is, you know, the water and the river where we are starts out as one of the cleanest tributaries to Lake Baikal. By the time it gets to Lake Baikal, going through the industrial part of Mongolia and the industrial part of Lake Baikal, or of Russia, it's one of the dirtiest. So we're at the headwaters, and that's where the fish are. At one time, I'm sure there were big Taimen all the way through here. When we first got over to Mongolia, we used to fish down here where the Selenge started in a place called Three Rivers. You got the Delgar, the Eder, and the Chalut right there. And, you know, that was really, really good Taimen fishing. Now that's probably not nearly as, I mean, it's just much tougher. There's just not much there anymore. So, you know, there are very few places, and you can kind of, and that's why we've really focused our energy as much as possible on one particular drainage. So we set up a conservation strategy, and a lot of this was hatched between myself and another guy by the name of Jeff Liebert, who was the first Peace Corps volunteer in Maroon back in 1993. And when he finished the Peace Corps, he became a cashmere goat trader in Ulaanbaatar, and then eventually went to work for the World Bank. And when he called us in probably 1999, in the spring, he said, hey, you guys need to talk to me because change is coming to Mongolia, and I don't think you're equipped, your fishery's equipped, or the region is equipped to deal with it. And I would like to put together a conservation project that blends a private company, a commercial interest, using a resource sustainably with conservation. And honestly, from all the stories I'd heard about the World Bank growing up and just going through college, I was pretty suspicious and not particularly interested, but he was pretty tenacious, and I just kept calling and calling and calling until one day he just showed up at our camp, and started to chat with him, and I realized he was probably right. So we set up a 4-part conservation strategy for Timon. First part, of course, is the part that we've been most involved with, and that was creating a resource, or creating an economic value to a resource that was essentially not utilized before we got there. So Timon are a fish that the Mongolians, they basically don't fish. That's changing, and certainly the ones that get further and that are more urbanized do have an interest in sports fishing, but the herders where we are on the Egger, you rarely, if ever, see them fish. And so we decided that, basically the idea was to create enough value in that fishery where we were paying a concession fee or a license fee to the local government, that we would give them the economic incentive necessary to continue to protect the fishery. The other part of the money that we pay in to the Ministry of, and this has changed with time. I'm talking about the original vision, which was then that money would be used to hire local rangers. And before we got this project really up and running, our company just funded 30 rangers along the river. Seemed pretty simple, thought this would be a great way to kind of keep track of the river, but we didn't really think about how do you go about giving them the deputization power necessary to write a ticket, because invariably what would happen is you'd see what we call them the big bosses from UB show up in a white Land Cruiser. They'd start fishing, and the herder, who's a warden, who we're paying, would go up and try to confront them, and they'd just kind of look at them like, you talking to me? And it just didn't work. So we had to kind of go back to the drawing board on that one. But that was the other piece, was basically to create a warden force that would be out on the river, a constant presence, and give them the power necessary to enforce the laws that we felt, and that the World Bank and the Mongolian Parliament felt were necessary to protect these fish. Keep going the wrong way. And so this is the sort of thing, and this is just sort of an example of what the wardens were looking for. We did have a real issue, and still do, with the Mongolians liking to take fish home. The other part, which was probably the key innovation, I think, of what we designed and what we put together, was called faith-based conservation. And it's not at all coincidental that this was during the Bush administration, and we thought faith-based conservation, that's got to resonate. And so the idea was, and the Mongolians are traditionally Buddhist, and the Buddhists in our valley, in the Egger Valley, had a really vibrant and pretty big monastery up until about 1936 or 37, at which point the Mongolian army at the Russian army's direction came in and burned down the monastery. And at one point in time, there were 400 monks living in our valley, living in this monastery, and it was really the cultural center of the valley. And the idea is that the Buddhists, by their very nature and by their religion, are conservationists, and it is pretty much leave things alone, let nature take its course, because that's how it was intended to be. I'm not a theologist, but that's my rough translation. But the idea was to bring that faith, or give them a place in Mongolia, in our valley, where that faith could start to reestablish itself, work its way back out into the herding communities, and bring that approach to people's decision making as it related to the river. So the idea was that this monastery that had housed 400 people at one point in time was gone. So we decided that we would set up we needed to raise some money from private sources to help us build a monastery back in the area where the original monastery had been. So we formed something called the Tributary Fund, and hired Betsy Gaines Quammen, who I think came through this EVST program back pretty much when I was in school, in the mid-90s, to run this tributary fund. And the first order of business was for her to go out and raise $250,000 to build this monastery. And Betsy, to her credit, did that, and then the tributary fund has gone on to be a pretty critical partner in the overall conservation of this valley and the success of this project, but is also starting to work in other projects around Montana, around the United States, and around the world. This monastery, it's hard to really emphasize just how important it was to the people of this valley, and we didn't really have a sense of it until we built this. And The day we built it or finished it and had the inauguration ceremony, we had probably 1,000 people show up with horses and come to pray. And when they opened the doors, you saw women that were 75, 80 years old who remembered when that monastery was still around when they were little kids, and men feeling the same way. And just it's not something as a fishing guide you ever expect to see, but this monastery being reopened and restored to the valley was something that one of the key innovations of our project, but also to date the most enduring gift, I think, of the World Bank's efforts and our efforts in the Edgar watershed. The other part is the Taimen, as I mentioned, were really, really understudied worldwide. There'd never been a Western study. So as we were going about trying to figure out how do we develop the right regulations and laws to protect Taimen, to get, for the enforcement guys to enforce, how do we go about, we need to understand a little bit more about this fishery. So we were really lucky in pairing up with the University of Nevada, Reno, University of California, Davis, and the University of Wisconsin, Madison fisheries departments to fund this and perform pretty much the first Taimen study done by a Western university. So the science team had several of its goals, and the idea is just, and I'm sure it's pretty evident, but the science team would have a series of outputs that they would show. They basically identify these different trends, and it would be about population, how many fish are in the river, what is the age structure, where do the fish move, what is their critical habitat, what do they need to eat, are there other species we need to be concerned about as part of the food chain, what are the environmental needs, and then fifth, and it's something that's still a real issue, is there was really no fisheries students and fisheries scientists in Mongolia. There is one PhD, I guess now there's three, but when we first started there was one PhD, and there really wasn't a group of fisheries biologists. I mean, if any of you have heard about the North American model of wildlife conservation, there really wasn't that professional cadre of scientists to help the regulatory agencies make sure they protected these fish and help them design effective regulations to design these fish. So that was the fifth part, was to really get a group of Mongolian students into the higher echelons of fisheries management so they could, when the study was over, they could be the people to take over fisheries management for Mongolia. And to a large degree that's really worked. One of the guides, one of the people that works for us and also works for the Taimen Conservation Fund that grew up on the river, named Ganzarig. He's working with the Ministry of Nature, and the other guy is named Soksakin, and I don't really know exactly what his position is with the Ministry of Nature, but he's a person who now has a PhD and is leading a lot of the Taimen conservation and the Taimen regulatory work in Mongolia. So the science, first thing the idea was, okay, when we first started this, the idea was we'd set up sort of a Taimen concession. We'd develop 3 or 4 concessions and then have people bid on the concessions. And we were pretty hopeful that we would win those bids, but we wanted to make sure that this concession was set up in a way that it would really provide a sustainable fishery from the perspective of the operator, but also that it would include the nursery grounds, the spawning grounds, the feeding habitat of the Taimen, viable population of the spawning adults, and really try to encapsulate everywhere a fish lived during the course of a year. The other, one of the things the key for doing that is trying to figure out how many fish do we have in the river. So we set up a tagging system, but we also set up some very serious sonars up and down the river and put in some electronic tracking mechanisms in the bigger fish so we could find out where they were moving and when they were moving. And one of the things that happened, one of the first year we put a very expensive tracking device in one of the bigger Taimen, and a big boss man came from UB, and he was fishing, and he killed a fish with with a sonar device inside of it. And the scientists saw this fish driving out of the valley, and off it went. And this sounds like a bad story, but the guy actually passed away 5 or 6 days later. And Mongolians are very superstitious people, and they correlated those two events. So that was helpful. Other part, the way the scientists and the way the fishing, our fishermen help to work with the scientists, is your basic Floy tag system. So every guide has a book, and every fish we catch, we tag, and then we can just kind of keep track of. When we catch the fish again, we measure them, take the girth, take a fin sample, so we can start doing some of the DNA studies and the gene studies, genetic studies of the fish. And we put tracking devices in, I think 100 Taimen, and we probably tagged between 200 and 300 fish over the course of the study. And what we found is they were very, very few. Our recapture rate was about 7 or 8%. So what that led them to believe is we actually had more fish in the river than we thought. And of the fish that we'd put the more sophisticated devices in, I think the mortality was remarkably small. So the fish were doing well, they were surviving, and they just, turns out there were probably more fish than we actually were giving them, than we all thought. Somebody had the hard job of, after we put all these tags and acoustic tags and fish, has to be out in Mongolia or out in the Agur all winter and track where these fish move. And I don't know if any of you have watched the weather report in UB at all over the winter, but it's not at all uncommon for it to be 20 below zero for 6 straight weeks. It is cold. And so these guys are out there every single day. Every single day, and you can see them with their horses traveling around. They put basically what happens is they put the acoustic tag in, they release it, and then they've got these sonar buoys or sonar devices in the bottom of the river so they can track where fish move, and then they also just track them by horse. The other project we started to work on, which is one that's now, so when we first started, we used the Floy tags. That was how we were going to track the fish. We had a scientist that came out from the University of Washington who was working on a new technology, which was basically facial imprinting of taimen with spots. So now every time we catch a taimen, we just take a picture of basically their gill plate. And then he takes that picture back and he just puts it into his computer program, and it runs some sort of a program and figures out exactly which fish it was and whether it's been caught before. So we no longer have to put tags in, and it's turning out that this has turned out to be a very, very effective way for them to track the population of fish, figure out where does this fish move, has it grown. And then the last thing they do is, and the scientists love to do this, is they love to snorkel the river. And that's a picture of probably a 34, 35-inch taimen, which is 10 to 12-year-old fish. In the summer, instead of using the horses, they use rafts to track the taimen. And that's Gonzarig and his assistant tracking the fish in the middle of the winter. So what did we find out about the fish? We found out that unlike what we believed, which was that the fish had big ranges, they actually moved very little. So here you can see one fish's movement for a year. And that particular fish moved less than 5 kilometers in an entire year. So we had huge flood events. Mongolia gets these monstrous rains in the summer where the river, or at least the river where we are, will come up 6 to 10 feet. And these fish were not moving. And you can see where he lives in this big run. We call that the black hole. And he'll move up. There's a riffle up there that's probably 600-700 yards upriver. And he'll move down a little bit, but that's it. He just doesn't move. So it lets you know that this is either a really large fish. I guess he was 76 centimeters, so he wasn't that big. But these fish, that's where they live, and they don't move very far. So it tells you that you don't need probably as much range for a fish as you originally thought. Now here's a different fish. This is a really big fish, 125 centimeters, so that's about, 50 inches, 51 inches. This particular fish, so if you look here, the two rivers come together. This is the Egg River, this is the Ur River, and here's our acoustics buoys that are in the river. And that fish actually travels about 40 kilometers. And what they're finding is he would go all the way up to a particular spot 2 or 3 times a year and then move right back to the same spot. So a couple things, the average range of taimen is less than 20 kilometers, actually less, probably about 10 kilometers. You can see there's one taimen that actually moved close to 100 kilometers in a year. This is a fish that we tagged at the upper camp, and he moved all the way down to the lower camp. We tagged him down there, or caught him and measured his tag down there. Other thing, which is probably not particularly surprising, is that this is where the fish, or how the fish move during the year. So, we had these transceivers in the river, and you can see how many times the fish were going by the transceivers in a particular month. So January, colder than the heck, they don't move much at all. February, same. March, no movements at all. April, it starts to warm up. They start to get ready to spawn, and frankly, they spawn end of April, early May. And you can see a lot of movement in May during the spawning, and then they kind of go back to wherever it was they were. So they move up to spawn, and then they go back to what their traditional home range. And then July, they get make 85% of their moisture for the year they get in July, and the river's a bit of a mess. So they don't move much at all. And then you can see that in August, September, which is when we're there primarily, there's quite a bit of movement. And then October, they're starting to move back to their winter holes or their winter spots. And then November, December, they stay pretty much still. This is just another graph of that same movement we just talked about. Other thing, one of the things that the science team did right away, they wanted to find out where the fish spawned. And the best way to do this was to pretty much employ some of the local poachers. This guy lives right upriver from our camp. Really great guy, but he's been, and by poaching, I'm not talking a guy who goes out and kills hundreds of fish. He might go out and kill one fish here, one fish there to eat during the year. And so he went out and showed them where these taimen spawn. And one of the things they found about taimen spawning is these taimen would each lay 3 different nests. So they'd build 3 different spawning beds. And the spawning beds would be in a place where if the river really came up, there was a big rain, it would be okay. So they had spawning beds for each type of water event that they might encounter. If it got really low and warm, if it got really high and muddy, there were at least one of the 3 nests that was designed to survive. One of the things they did was try to figure out, okay, we know these fish, what is it that makes these fish spawn? And what they ultimately decided is that fish spawn because of the water temps hitting a certain date. So Mongolia, for example, has seen an incredible warm-up over the last, when we first got there, and this has only been 18 years, but Mongolia was a lot colder 18 years ago. It's really changed a lot in the 18 years I've been there. And so the areas that, red is where so it's the lowest part of the drainages. That was where they thought you could open the fishery on the 20th of May. Further up the drainages, you would be, they think June 1st, and then at the highest points of the drainages where the rivers are the coldest and the water temps the coldest, I think you should open it June 15th. So this was done, and I think, frankly, at this point, and eventually, you're going to see the red move all the way through a lot of these places because it's just getting warmer. I mean, Lake Hoofsgold, which is right up here, the east side used to be pretty much all permafrost, and now it's almost marsh. You can just drive. You can't drive through a lot of the places you used to be able to drive through because the permafrost is gone. So the other part, as I mentioned before, was trying to figure out what taimen eat. You can see this is a lennik, which is the trout species, and basically, if you're trying to figure out where the taimen are, catch a lennik and then just let them run over the pool, and you can find out pretty quickly who's there. You can see this lennik has obviously survived an encounter with a taimen. Taimen eat pretty much anything. I've watched taimen eat mice. I've watched them eat squirrels. The biggest taimen I've ever landed with a client was after I watched this taimen eat a duck. And literally what happened was we were walking up the bank of this river, and we jumped a mother mallard and some ducklings. This was like early September, so they were pretty good-sized ducks at that point. And one of the ducklings was just kind of lollygagging, and suddenly this huge taimen came up and just ate the duck. So we got pretty excited, and we ended up, and this fish was absolutely in a frenzy. And we hooked that fish 5 times before we finally landed it. Other thing they eat in probably 95% of their diet is smaller taimen. We've found taimen over the years with one of the biggest taimen we found dead was a 56-inch taimen that had a 34-inch taimen stuck in its gullet, and it just choked itself. So they are pretty, they're just very, very voracious. On the other hand, we've also caught, 4 years ago, we caught a 52-inch taimen on just your basic chubby Chernobyl pattern. So go figure. They eat anything and everything. If it's in their wheelhouse, they will eat it. This is that taimen that we hooked on the grasshopper, which seems kind of ridiculous. That is a taimen they found dead that had a muskrat in it. And these are trout, and so these are kind of, we're sitting there trying to fish with our flies that, a 4-inch fly gets pretty hard to cast. This is why those guys in Russia had such a hard time competing. There's the time when I told you about that it choked on the 34-inch taimen. It was really tragic to lose either of those fish. That fish, the big fish, that's an old fish, probably 35, 40 years old, and he just, as you might say, bit off more than he can chew. So the other thing we wanted to find out is, when I first got over there, we'd been told that taimen were really old fish, and I really sincerely thought that these bigger fish were close to 50 years old. And as you probably know, one of the ways you study how old a trout is or how old a salmon is from the otolith, which is the bone in between the ears, basically, and they just count the rings. And we had 11 taimen that they found dead over the years that they took otoliths back to a laboratory, I think it was at the University of Oregon, and determined the age. And there you can see essentially what they determined. The literature, I guess, had told them that, if you're catching a taimen that's 120 centimeters, so what's that, 48 inches, give or take, that's a fish that could be, 15, 20 years old. And those bigger fish that we're catching, they're getting closer to 30. So what that tells you is the bigger fish in a drainage and in a fishery are really critical from a commercial standpoint. From a commercial fishery, if you want to bring people over there to fish and create an economic value to the resource, you need to keep those big fish around. And if you lose all those fish, it takes a long time for that to regenerate. When we first got over there, we kind of kept thinking, we'd catch a 60-inch taimen and we'd say, wow, I wonder when we're going to catch a 64 or a 65 or a 70. But what you eventually conclude is they're just like people. They only get so big. And every now and then you're going to find an outlier, which is a 7'6" person. But by and large, most people are about 6'4" or 5'8" or whatever. So these fish, the average fish probably doesn't get above 48 inches. But there are a few that, fortunately make it into that next echelon. Preliminary findings, so you can tell that the taimen growth is a little bit slower than what the literature has suggested, but that the, basically is, they only get so big. The thing, as I was mentioning earlier, because the bigger fish are so old, even a relatively low level of harvest could depress the average size of the fish. And then if you did have poaching or overfishing, it would take a long time for those fish to come back. Which is why, it became so apparent. We really had to really figure out how we were going to go about setting up some regulations that were going to protect, be able to protect this river and prevent, at least initially, the only threat we could really hope to counteract, which was overfishing or inappropriate fishing. So what is the management goal for the region? Sustainable recreational fishery by catch and release angling. One of the things I'm most encouraged about is we are seeing more fishermen on the Agur, but the difference is we are now seeing, the people we're seeing fishing are now practicing catch and release. They don't all do it the right way, they don't all do it well, but the concept is there. It's no longer hold up a dead taimen to show people that I caught a big taimen. They're really learning how to do this well. And part of that's because, the Taimen Conservation Fund, the World Wildlife Federation, other different groups that are present over there have put together small public service announcements that are videos of how to properly practice catch and release fishing. And, you know, that's probably, I mean, it's not realistic to think that you can have a river or keep a river private in a world that has 6 billion people. But if you can figure out how to get the people that are using the resource to do it in a way that people have the opportunity to do it when they follow you in 10 or 12 years, then you've actually probably done something really unique. Conclusions. Basically, and this was the conclusion that we were hoping they'd find, and that is that 100% catch and release recreational fishery has little impact on the Taiman population, but that if you you had inappropriate recreational harvest, you could really affect the fishery. As anybody who's ever looked at this would know, commercial fishing is probably, at least with taimen and say bone fishing, is the most ineffective use of a particular resource from an economic perspective. If you were to commercial fish the taimen and the agur, you were looking between $10,000 and $20,000 a year of revenue that you could generate from that fish. The catch and release commercial operation, you could expect to generate somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000. And then finally, that the movement rates are 20 to 40. The concession size should be 20 to 40 kilometers in size. So with that data, we put together some concessions, and we thought, well, this would make sense. We'll have an auction. They're already doing mining concessions and logging concessions. Fishing, catch and release fishing concessions should be pretty easy sell, but we were woefully wrong, and it was really very unpopular and really controversial. So we stepped back, and we're taking a different approach to trying to create fishing zones for people where a person has a vested interest in doing a good job with how they manage the fishery. Fisheries science in Mongolia, where is it today after 10 years of this study? There's still very few fish biologists, but there are more than there were. Fisheries research and proactive management, almost non-existent, but it is getting better, and that's because the people that have kind of been associated with this project and with other projects in Mongolia are now in positions where they can actually, they're working for the government, they're working for the Ministry of Nature, and they are having an impact. And that one of the key things for managing a resource effectively is getting well-educated fisheries managers on the ground so they can monitor what's going on, know what's going on, and adapt the management of the river based on population fluctuations. I can tell you all day anecdotally what's happening on the river, and most fishermen can, but it's really critical to have somebody who actually has data and understands the more complex nature of a fishery that can kind of monitor it, tell you what's going on. So these are just a few kind of parting images. This is another big taimen caught in late September, early October. And this is my favorite sequence, and it kind of sums up pretty much what we're doing. This woman has been over there twice, and she has broken the world record 2 times. And this is a fish she caught that was the new world record. It was 60.5 inches. And so here she is. She's just taking a few pictures of the fish, and she's putting it back in the water. And there it goes. And that fish is still there. If you drive up that river and you go cast right beyond that log, that fish is still living there. So that's pretty neat. And that's one of the things that makes what we're trying to do, in my opinion, very compatible with the long-term protection of this fishery. I thought Matt Davies might be here. He's a guide from here in Missoula who works with us over there. And this is the previous world record holder on our river, on the Agur, this past fall. And then there's a lawyer here in town named Jerry Steinbrenner who also caught this fish when he made a trip over there. And this is actually Dan at Three Rivers in 1999. And then this is kind of the partnership that we've had ever since the beginning. That's me on the right. So that's the commercial side, the Buddhist monastery monk in the middle, and then the scientists on the side. And that's really, that picture as well as anything kind of captures what we've been trying to accomplish over there. And hopefully we will succeed. I think we are succeeding And honestly, if my children have the opportunity to catch a taimen in 10 or 12 years when they get over there, then I think we'll have succeeded, because at that point in time, it won't be about Americans funding taimen conservation in Mongolia. It'll be about Mongolians doing it, and that's really where you hope to end up. And these are the different folks that have been involved. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any. As she mentioned, I'm also the commissioner for District 2 of the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So if you have any questions about any Fish, Wildlife, and Parks issues, we'll kill two birds with one stone. So feel free to ask any questions.
Historically, what was the utilizing the time as
It was really just a matter of, well, historically, it was mostly a matter that the Buddhist faith and they have a sutra, at least in the Buddhist monastery where we were, was that every fish that, if you kill a fish, it's worth 10,000 souls. So there was a strong Buddhist teaching that you don't harvest fish. And frankly, that was one of the challenges we faced, was trying to get the Buddhists on board with what is, not necessarily a very comfortable experience for fish, which is catching, releasing, and putting them back in the water. But they took a fairly pragmatic approach to that. So there was that component to it. The other part is just a practical side to it, which is they've got thousands of cows, thousands of sheep, horses and goats, which are in their backyard, and they just use those for food, and it's a lot easier.
Do those large taimen have any natural predators?
They really don't. I suppose theoretically, and I've seen eagles go after them, but not the really big ones. The big ones they're pretty much the king or queen of the castle. Yep.
You talked about the difficulties of getting law enforcement going and giving them jurisdiction and authority. How did that finally come about?
So when we first set that up, we had the wardens working for the local government, but there weren't really local regulations that were enforceable on a person who came from Ulaanbaatar, broke the local rule, and then went back to UB. I mean, you could put him through a quote-unquote local court in Erdenbolgen, which is the small town that's near us, but they had no ability to reach out to the people in UB. So now we've worked with the Ministry of Nature, and they've got fish wardens and actually fish inspectors, game inspectors that are in charge of our area and the Agur, and they've actually deputized wardens. So now they have the authority to enforce federal law where we are. And they, last year, we had a group of Russians come down the river, and we showed up, and the wardens were, they were still a little intimidated by the big Russians, and the Russians were sort of tough on them. They backed off, but when the Russians got to the bottom of the canyon, they got to the bridge, the higher authorities were there, and they confiscated all their gear, took their fishing rods, took their rafts, and threw them in jail. So that's pretty serious, and that's not something that would have happened 4 years ago where we are. And my experience has always been, you do that a few times, and you have fewer people trying to challenge the rules and push those, try to push around those rules, and you get compliance. Yep.
How worried are you about fishing and conserving yourself out of your resource? I mean, there's a lot of people that know about the egg and the water now because of the work you've done. You're worried about guys coming from UB and build homes, and at the end of the day.
Sure. That was why when the World Bank guy called us and said, when we first announced, we kind of brought this fishery to the fly fishing public of the United States. We named it the Ariel and the Bator River. We made up the names. We didn't tell anybody where we were fishing, but that was kind of naive of us to believe that you can keep a secret that long. And so he convinced us that we needed to, basically publish the name of the river, let people know where we were fishing, but make sure that you develop the rules necessary to, so when the guys from Ulaanbaatar build a house and they want to come out and fish, that they practice catch and release. And so it's like somebody who buys a big ranch on the, the banks of the Madison and builds a huge house and goes out and fishes, but they do it in a way that typically doesn't affect the fishery long term. So really, I think it's just giving the river the tools to regulate the people, how people use it. Yep.
I just want to make sure I read your slide right. You said $300,000 to $500,000 for ecotourism type of fishing. Is that just in that one watershed, or is that Mongolia?
Just in the watershed.
And what, just out of curiosity, what percentage of that stays in Mongolia?
You know, I'd say everybody's a little different. The way we operate it is we basically pay, so we charge for our fishery, we charge each client $5,500 for a week of fishing, and then we pay our partner a set amount for the right to fish, and then also all of our clients buy a $200, $300, whatever the price is, time and stamp. So I would say, you know, after expenses, that the ratio has changed a great deal over time, because it used to be we could rent a helicopter for $300 an hour. We now pay $2,000. So, you know, that's money that's getting spent in Mongolia, but it's not necessarily getting spent within the valley. So, yeah, I would say every year it's a little different, but you know, that's kind of the rough breakdown. Yep.
So you emphasize like scientists and activists and I guess your organization as being the primary kind of actors in your conservation strategy. I'm just wondering, law enforcement, what role would they play?
What law enforcement, what would play? Oh, the government, well, yeah, I mean, government, they give us the authority to operate over there, and, you know, so our partner basically is the outfitter over there, and so that's one role they play. The other big role the government plays, and I really think it's just kind of making sure that development that goes on along the river, nothing to do with fisheries resource, but that it's compatible with environmental quality. So making sure that you don't have a mine that goes in right next to the river, or you don't have a big water project that goes in and suddenly dewaters the river. So they play a pretty, I mean, the fishery over there is completely, as it is here, is completely dependent upon having public sector support. Yep.
You talked about how some of the fish are only moving 10 kilometers a year. What do you know what their life history is?
Well, I mean, from what I've been told by the scientists, they start to spawn and they reach sexual maturity about 12 or 13 years.
Maintain like that same habitat over that time frame?
You know, I would, in my experience, yeah. I mean, so I've been fishing over there since 1995, and there are still several fish that I've probably caught 10 or 12 times over that 15 years. And there are fish that I have fished for 15 years, and we finally landed last fall. So yeah, they don't move a great deal. But they, you know, I mean, I think they're a little bit probably like bears. You know, the bigger they get, the more likely they are to move into the primary feeding spot. And the little guys kind of sit on the edges and pick up minnows here and there, and then work their way up the food chain. Yep.
I'm curious, when the World Bank came in the 90s, did they try to institute sort of Western-style conservation laws, administrative policies for pollution and that kind of thing? Or you know, how does that get dealt with if someone opened a gold mine right on the banks of the river?
You know, they did. I mean, I think they funded, I mean, the way it worked was going to work with us, and the idea was, okay, we know that we want to accomplish time and conservation on the Igor watershed. So the Time and Conservation Fund actually hired a lobbyist in UB to lobby the Parliament to get the specific regulations passed to promote time and conservation in Mongolia. So that, I mean, it's not too different than the way regulations and laws get made in the United States.
And what happens if there's pollution or some, you know, is there like a tort?
You know, I think there's been one or two attempts at environmental torts. There's no question it's coming. There are parts of Mongolia where the mining companies who, you know, and these are not American mining companies, they're not Canadian mining companies, and I don't even know, I mean, there's some renegade mining going on over there, and there's just some horrific conditions under which, you know, small communities that have been together for thousands of years, suddenly this mine comes in and they can't drink their water. Or there's mercury everywhere. So there's people over there pursuing that. I know that we've had 2 clients that have fished with us that are environmental lawyers that have gone over to work with law firms in Ulaanbaatar to help them do that.
Yeah, through the population study, did they get an idea of density of attainment, say, if we say in relation to Now, if you're on the best section of the Yellowstone, and you're saying there's this many brown trout in the mile. Where does King line up?
I think the number I want to say is 10 fish per kilometer. And those would be fish that are like 26 to over 26 inches, give or take. So not very many.